Hello students. Today we will take up the second chapter from your supplementary reader textbook snapshots. The title of the chapter is The Address. This chapter has been written by Marga Minko. Marga Minko was born on 31st March 1920. She is Dutch journalist and writer who later in her life started writing novels and stories based on her experiences. She was the lone survivor of her family during the German invasion of Netherlands. Her parents, brother, sister, all were deported to concentration camps and never returned. After she escaped, she spent the rest of the war hiding with the poet and translator Bert Witten, whom she later on married. So before beginning the reading of the chapter, I will give you a quick introduction of the chapter. The story, The Address, is about the human predicament, human difficulties that follow the pre-war and the post-war period. Mrs. S., who was a Jewish woman and was a rich lady, whereas Mrs. Dorling was a non-Jew. The girl daughter of Mrs. S. had lost her house and her mother during the war, and now she had decided to come back to take her possessions from Mrs. Dorling, an old acquaintance whose address was given by her mother years ago. When she reached the house, the woman treated her with a cold reception and didn't let her into the house. She decided to go back anyway, and then she met her daughter, who let her in and told her to wait inside. When she saw all the possessions of her mother in front of her, she couldn't connect with them and decided to leave the house. Let us now begin reading the chapter. This short story is a poignant account of a daughter who goes in search of her mother's belongings after the war in Holland. When she finds them, the objects evoke memories of her earlier life. However, she decides to leave them all behind and resolves to move on. "Do you still know me?" I asked. The woman looked at me searchingly. She had opened the door a chink. I came closer and stood on the step. "No, I don't know you." "I am Mrs. S.'s daughter." She held her hand on the door as though she wanted to prevent it opening any further. Her face gave absolutely no sign of recognition. She kept staring at me in silence. Perhaps I was mistaken, I thought. Perhaps it isn't her. I had seen her only once fleetingly, and that was years ago. It was most probable that I had rung the wrong bell. The woman let go of the door and stepped to the side. She was wearing my mother's green knitted cardigan. The wooden buttons were rather pale from washing. She saw that I was looking at the cardigan and half hid herself again behind the door. But I knew now that I was right. So here the protagonist, the speaker, asked the woman standing at the door if she still knew her. The woman had opened the door a chink, which means that the woman had opened the door a little only. And then the speaker came closer to the door and stood closer to the woman there who opened the door. Now, what was the woman's response? The woman responded very negatively and said that she had no idea who the narrator was. Now here the protagonist, the narrator, still gave her introduction to the lady, and she said she was Mrs. S.'s daughter. Now, the narrator tells us that the woman had held the door tightly as she didn't want her to enter the house. Also, she kept staring at the speaker, though she could not recognize her. So, the protagonist thought maybe she had come to the wrong house. She then says that the woman who she wanted to meet, she had seen that woman only for a short period of time, and that too years ago. Okay, so she was not very much sure whether she was at the right door or not. Then what happened? The woman who answered the door stepped aside and let go of the door, and on seeing her, the narrator recognized her mother's green knitted cardigan. So that woman was wearing the narrator's green knitted cardigan, which the narrator was able to recognize. Now, the narrator says that the wooden buttons of the cardigan had become pale because of frequent washing, and the woman noticed this, that the narrator was looking at the cardigan, and therefore, what she does, she hid behind the door, and it is that moment, it is then when the protagonist, when the speaker knew that she had come to the right house. Okay, let us read further. Well, you knew my mother, I asked. Have you come back? Said the woman. I thought that no one had come back. Only me. A door opened and closed in the passage behind her. A musty smell emerged. I regret I cannot do anything for you. I've come here specially on the train. I wanted to talk to you for a moment. It is not convenient for me now, said the woman. I can't see you. Another time. She nodded and cautiously closed the door as though no one inside the house should be disturbed. I stood where I was on the step. The curtain in front of the bay window moved. Someone stared at me and would then have asked what I wanted. Oh, nothing, the woman would have said. It was nothing. So, after the speaker was sure that she was at the right door, she then asked the woman about her mother, to which the woman asked the narrator if she had come back, and said that she had thought that no one had come back. So the narrator replied to her that no one else other than her had returned back. Okay. Further, then it's told that a door opened and closed in the passage behind the woman, and a stale smell occurred all over. There was a stale smell that emerged from her house. Further, the woman told the narrator that she could not do anything for her, she cannot help her in any way, and the narrator told her that she had come from far off place on the train just to talk to her, and the woman told her that it was not convenient for her to talk at that moment and asked her to come back later someday. Now the woman then closed the door, and she didn't wanted anyone to get disturbed in her house. So the protagonist was still standing on the step. She was all in shock, and she was still standing on the step of that house, and she saw a curtain moving on the window bay, and she saw that someone was staring at her from inside the house, and she just thinks this within her mind, that that's someone who was peeping from inside. He or she would have asked the woman what I wanted, to which the woman would have replied or would have told that I was standing outside, just like that. Okay, it was nothing serious. Okay, now let us move ahead. Let us read further. I looked at the nameplate again. Darling, it said, in black letters on white enamel, and on the jamb, a bit higher, the number 46. As I walked slowly back to the station, I thought about my mother, who had given me the address years ago. It had been in the first half of the war. I was home for a few days and it struck me immediately that something or other about the rooms had changed. I missed various things. My mother was surprised I should have noticed so quickly. Then she told me about Mrs. Dorling. I had never heard of her, but apparently she was an old acquaintance of my mother, whom she hadn't seen for years. She had suddenly turned up and renewed their contact. Since then, she had come regularly. So here the speaker then looked at the number plate of the house again and she saw the name Dorling written on the plate of it on white enamel. And on the jamb, means on the side post of a window, there was this number mentioned, the number 46. Now, then, as the narrator was going back when she left this house of Mrs. Dorling, as she was going back to the station, she was thinking, she started to think about her mother, who gave her the address of this lady, Mrs. Dorling, and she gave her the address years ago, and it was the first she remembers that it was the first half of the war when when the mother had given her the address of Mrs. Dorling. Now she is now recalling all the old memories and telling the readers that she was home for a few days and suddenly it she observed, it struck her that the room was different, the room of her house was different, and she observed that there were various things in the room which were missing. Okay, there were certain things which were missing from the room of her house. Further, she says that her mother was very much surprised that the narrator could notice these changes, the missing things, so quickly. Okay, and it was at that time, she says, it was at that time when she told her about this woman, when the mother told her about this woman, Mrs. Dorling. So the narrator's mother told the narrator that Mrs. Dorling was an old contact, an old acquaintance of hers whom she hadn't seen for years, and one day suddenly she came to visit her, and since then they had been in a regular contact. Okay, further let us read. Every time she leaves here, she takes something home with her, said my mother. She took all the table silver in one go, and then the antique plates that hung there. She had trouble lugging those large vases, and I am worried she got a crick in her back from the crockery. My mother shook her head pityingly. I would never have dared ask her. She suggested it to me herself. She even insisted. She wanted to save all my nice things. If we have to leave here, we shall lose everything, she says. Have you agreed with her that she should keep everything? I asked. As if that's necessary, my mother cried. It would simply be an insult to talk like that. And think about the risk she is running each time she goes out of our door with a full suitcase or bag. So here the narrator's mother told her that whenever that woman Dorling came to visit her to her place, she took something or the other from the narrator's house with her. Okay, things like table silvers, antique plates, and she also says that she had trouble over carrying the large vases. The mother further told the narrator that Mrs. Dorling got a cramp in her back because of the crockery which she was carrying, as the crockery was very much heavy in weight. Also, Mrs. Dorling kept telling the narrator's mother that she wanted to save the narrator's mother's precious things, as if they had to leave the place someday. If they would have to leave the place someday, then all the things that belonged to them would be safe with Mrs. Dorling. Okay, so they would this way in this way they would never lose all those things, all those precious things. Now, further, the narrator asks her mother if she really wanted Mrs. Dorling to take all their things with her to her house. To which the mother replied that even if she didn't wanted to give her all the things, give all the things to Mrs. Dorling, still she says it would be an insult to ask her not to take things to her house, and moreover, she thought that Mrs. Dorling was going out with a risk herself. She was at a great risk herself because she was moving out of their house daily with a suitcase full of items. Okay. Further, let us read. My mother seemed to notice that I was not entirely convinced. She looked at me reprovingly, and after that we spoke no more about it. Meanwhile, I had arrived at the station without having paid much attention to the things on the way. I was walking in familiar places again for the first time since the war. But I did not want to go further than was necessary. I didn't want to upset myself with the sight of streets and houses full of memories from a precious time. In the train back, I saw Mrs. Dorling in front of me again, as I had the first time I met her. It was the morning after the day my mother had told me about her. I had got up late, and coming downstairs, I saw my mother about to see someone out. A woman with a broad back. "There is my daughter," said my mother. She beckoned to me. The woman nodded and picked up the suitcase under the coat rack. She wore a brown coat and a shapeless hat. "Does she live far away?" I asked, seeing the difficulty she had going out of the house with a heavy case. "In Marconi Street," said my mother. "Number 46. Remember that." Okay. So, the narrator's mother noticed that the narrator wasn't convinced with what her mother had, with what she had said about Mrs. Dorling, and she looked at her mother critically. The narrator was looking at her mother very critically because she was not happy with what explanation that the mother gave about Mrs. Dorling. Now, after that day, she never talked about the incident, that particular incident again with her mother. Finally, the narrator reached the station. We all know this, that she was just recalling the old days, and now currently she has now reached the station without and she says that she didn't, because she was so caught up in all her thoughts. Therefore, she could not notice any of the details around her on the way back to the station. And she says she passed the familiar things after the war for the first time, and she didn't want to upset herself with the familiar sights of the houses and streets that reminded her of all the precious time, old precious times. Now, back in the time again, she talks about, she again recalls the old memories. The narrator, she says, saw Mrs. Dorling in person, personally, a day after her mother told her daughter about Mrs. Dorling. Okay. She says that she woke up late that morning, and as she was moving downstairs, as she was going downstairs, she saw the lady with broad back, it's told. And she saw Mrs. Dorling, who was the lady with the broad back, and the narrator saw that her mother was seeing her out. Her mother then introduced the narrator to the lady. Mrs. Dorling then picked the suitcase, the heavy suitcase, under her coat rack, and it's told that she was wearing a brown coat and a shapeless hat. Now, the narrator asked her mother at this moment, if this lady, about this lady, Mrs. Dorling, whether she lived far away, and the narrator's mother told her the address, Marconi Street, number 46, and she also told the narrator to remember this address, Marconi Street, number 46. Okay, so we'll be covering only till here in this session. I request you all to please go through the entire part or entire portion that we have covered today and mark the difficult words. Also, keep your doubts for the next session. Thank you, everyone.